3, 2, 1. Hi everyone. Welcome again to another very interesting episode with Dr. Bhaskar. We can skip the introductions this time around, but just for us to get started, how are you, Dr. Bhaskar, and how are things?
Yes, all good. Everything all good so far.
Good. So we've planned based on the feedback that we're receiving as well. We have planned a couple of the next episode. If there are any interesting episodes that you recommend, please go down in the comment section and tell us about any specific things that us to discuss. Today, what we are going to be discussing is something which would be very fascinating or interesting, I think, for a lot of not only students, but also for practicing consultant psychiatrists like ourselves, because we tend to reflect, we tend to think, we tend to want to keep ourselves up to date in clinical practice as well with regards to the recent happenings. But at the same time, the main, I keep telling this to a lot of people, is that an internal medicine doctor has chest x-rays, electrocardiograms, stethoscope, and a lot of things he can use as the diagnostic tool. We are slightly limited that clinical history is our main diagnostic tool. But what do we diagnose? And the holy book or the holy grail of our diagnosis is DSM and ICD. So we are going to be discussing that. Diagnosis in psychiatry, diagnostic manuals, diagnostic procedures. So without further ado, Dr. Bhaskar, the stage is all yours. Please set the stage.
The thing is, I would start with description of a personality in psychiatry whom we all have forgotten. Actually, if we talk about psychiatry, we always talk about Freud. Some of us who delve into history of psychiatry, they would talk about some other people, like the French neurologists who were at that time thinking about how brain works and things like that. But possibly most of us would not remember the German psychiatrists who actually were first bona fide psychiatrists who were talking about brain and how brain works. And the first name that should have been named as father of psychiatry was Wilhelm Griesinger. Wilhelm Griesinger is now a forgotten figure in history, but he was in true sense the father of psychiatry. He first said before anyone else that all the psychiatric symptoms, all the psychiatric signs that we see are due to brain and brain only. He envisioned a world where everything in psychiatry is brain related and is based on brain. But then psychiatry deviated from it and went into uncharted areas where it is still swimming. So any discussion of psychiatric taxonomy, psychiatric diagnosis should start Wilhelm Griesinger, the unknown father of psychiatry whom psychiatry doesn't remember. Griesinger is yes, I would just say one thing about Griesinger, then you can always take the stage. Griesinger is only remembered in ENT, and that too as battle sign or Griesinger sign, where a erythema and edema over mastoid process is due to mastoid vein thrombosis, and that is known as Griesinger sign. Yes, Mandan, you are talking something.
Yeah, I was just saying that there's if one reads into all of the anti-psychiatry movement and all the psychiatry criticisms that have been written, there's always this there's a lot written about German psychiatrists and the whole idea of institutionalization and how they had in a way the whole idea of conformity. You know where I'm going with it, right? I'm
Yes.
trying to find, because we've got an international audience, I'm trying to find the politically correct way to say it. Is that there's a lot of criticism of a certain time in psychiatry when, especially I think during or around the World War II, when psychoanalysis as a widespread science, is the whole idea of institutionalizing people and conformity being promoted. And at that time, a lot of German and Russian psychiatrists then also doing helping sort of the government to institutionalize non-conformist people.
Yes.
Do you want to shed some light on that side before we delve into DSM ICD as well? I know that must be something really interesting.
That was a black era of brain science, because what happened was, I would not blame them. I would say they were victim of their human world. In Russia and in Germany, there were two different periods where there were rabid hyper-nationalism. In Germany, that era is known as Nazi era, and in Russia, that was the era of Stalin. In this time, all the scientists, be it medical scientists, be it other scientists, they colored their worldview in hyper-nationalism, and that resulted in they unknowingly or knowingly assisting the political regime by following the political regime. In, let's say, in atomic research, the Nazi physicist played a big role. Then, in various forms of other medical discovery, Nazi medical scientists did something truly wrong. There are various data like the German Doctor of Death and other things. Similarly, in psychiatry field too, the Germans and the Russians, they did much wrong thing in the name of their hyper-nationalism. In Germany, they tried to eliminate psychiatric illness by killing the patients of psychiatric illnesses. That was number one thing. That was very wrong, because eugenics doesn't work that way. You cannot eliminate some perceived weak genes and hope the population to become strong. Actually, only successful eugenics can happen when we introduce new, stronger genes in community gene pool, rather than we try to eliminate the perceived weak. The Germans did that. Then, obviously, German psychiatrists labeled anyone against the Nazi regime as schizophrenics, because schizophrenia is the most ill understood symptom in all psychiatry. So anything and anyone can be labeled as that. In Russia too, they did the same thing. In Stalin era, a lot of even Communist Party members were sentenced to various psychiatric institutions, as well as even were sentenced to Gulag prison and concentration camp like environment in Siberia because of that perceived schizophrenia attack. But that was part of our evolution as brain doctors. This was probably one of the most violent, I would say, and most unfortunate use and abuse of psychiatry to personal gains, to political gains. That was
I
truly
think,
a bad era.
yeah, absolutely. I think we do have a very wide international audience, and we do have
Hmm.
people who are patient service
Hmm.
users have used psychiatric services as well. So I
Hmm.
would want to say just a couple of things before we move on to the whole DSM ICD thing. Is a psychiatry, like any other science, is a science in itself, and which is rapidly evolving and which reflects whatever crisis the society is going through at that time. So we have seen the way, and that's why I wrote the Oppenheimer situation, that physics and atomic science is also a part of science. You will
Yes.
have good scientists, you will have bad scientists, you will have scientists who impact history. It was during the whole Nazi Germany era that we ended up also getting someone as useful to the psychiatric sciences as Sigmund Freud. He did Nazi Germany, and he was a Jew who then ended up living the last years of his life in London. So we by no means are saying that all German psychiatrists or all Russian
No.
psychiatrists during that time were involved in anything like that. However, like with any difficult phase during humanity, the way most society suffers in general, so do the sciences do,
Yes.
and psychiatry or physics is not immune to it. And wonder where hyper-nationalism, we don't see that anymore, do we, in today's day and age? So that danger doesn't lie now.
No, that danger doesn't lie because of the only thing. Somehow, yes, hyper-nationalism, fundamentalism is still a threat to science and humanity throughout the world. But the biggest advantage of humanity in today's world is the cursed social media. Social media made us so well connected that it is impossible for a group of people to stay only as fanatics. They would have to interact with other people, they would have to be challenged always. That is why in today's world it is very hard for a group of scientists to remain loyal to any particular social regime or political regime. Yes, we have some countries in world which have a particular hyper religious or hyper uh, I would say nationalist agenda, but ultimately even in those countries we have open-minded scientists, because in today's science collaboration is the key, and for collaboration there has to be open-mindedness. So social media,
Absolutely.
however blame it can be, but it is ultimately one of the salvations of today's science.
True. Absolutely. We can, on that note, we can go back to
Hmm.
the main topic and talk about Wilhelm Griesinger and how he contributed.
Yes.
Please
So
continue.
since I wanted to thank Wilhelm Griesinger because he is such a forgotten figure, and we students of brain should remember him because he was the first one in history who said all psychiatric symptoms are inside brain and brain only. Then came Freudian era and followers of Freud. Yes, Freud was an impactful figure, but he created a cult, and that cult, due to its presence in such an era where various things were in vogue, like let's say at that time of Freud, world was going through a lot of changes and a lot of things. So standing there, psychoanalysis became huge success because of its ability to question the status quo and things like that. But ultimately, that created one form of dogmatism. And that dogmatism led to opposition from various other thinkers. One of them is obviously Emil Kraepelin. Then, after Emil Kraepelin, there was a long gap. Then came Adolf Meyer. Adolf Meyer was more a balancing personality than a hard-nosed researcher, but he tried to balance things. He tried to make a balance between Kraepelinian pure biological understanding and psychoanalysis understanding of only environmental feature and other things. He tried to make a bridge, but his theory fell short because he ultimately, through his theories, he reached a point where he saw that there are genetic changes and there are environmental changes. And in his era, which is early 1900, 1910, at that time, thinking of modifying heritable factor was unimaginable. So in his psychobiology theory, he tried to change the environment, but still in his own way, he tried to give something forward which is not purely the dogmatism of at that era, which is psychoanalysis. Then slowly came another person. The second one who carried the idea of Adolf Meyer to create a balance between psychoanalysis and upcoming biological understanding. He was Roy Griesinger, the same Roy Griesinger who was the first person who coined biopsychosocial model. He created biopsychosocial model to describe how various biological factor and surrounding environmental factor influence a person's behavior and change their expression of diseases. Roy Griesinger is the first one who was actually the main person of creation of biopsychosocial model, for which engaged with most of the credit. He also created various other things, like if someone reads is a student of psychiatric history, they would find that he is also one of the persons who created the borderline personality from pseudo-neurotic schizophrenia and things like that. But he was a notable thinker who was one of those person who tried to create a balance between biological understanding and the dogmatism that was psychoanalysis at that time. Then there were lots of other people in between. For example, this should be worth mentioning, otherwise we would not understand why psychoanalysis survived. There are a group of people who thought that biology of brain disorders lay in toxins in various colonic bacteria. So they advocated colectomy, and many a person had total large intestine removal for curing of their psychiatric symptoms. Unfortunate, but that was one of the failed attempts to explain biology of psychiatric symptoms, and that gave psychoanalysis more validity. Then at that time there was also another infamous procedure, lobotomy, and one of the misbegotten Nobel Prizes of psychiatry. Lobotomy, I would not explain much because it was, although one of the psychosurgeries, but this is probably one of the most barbaric procedures that could have happened in history of our subject, and that has ultimately ruined the name of our subject. If anyone wants to see the romanticized version, then they are advised to see the film One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, the best example. And if anyone wants to know the historical view, I would advise them to read about how the person who devised lobotomy got Nobel Prize and subsequently was discredited. Anyway, then after a while came a physician who actually added the last straw to this psychiatric taxonomy formation, who was Engel. Engel was not a psychiatrist. He was a physician who had a illustrious uncle who was a famous physician of that time. Engel actually tried to emulate a new model of medicine. Why he tried to formulate medicine with combination of biological and environmental factor, we don't know. There are lots of reasons. Some says he was influenced to do so by his 5 years long training in psychoanalysis. Some says he was enamored with the father of medicine and he wanted to create another medicine overview like Dr. William Osler. Nobody knows actually why Engel tried to create a new form of medicine. But anyway, around 1970 onwards, he actually tried to create a overview of medicine where he merged the psychoanalytic concept of environment, childhood trauma and things like that, and along with that he also included the then understanding of biology of brain and created a theory which he borrowed the name from Roy Griesinger and gave it the name Biopsychosocial model. He published it twice. Once it was published in JAMA and then Journal of American Psychiatric Association. His JAMA publication was extremely poorly received and it was rejected through and through. But he got a sympathetic ear in American Psychiatric Society because the thing is, at that time, psychiatry was going through a crisis. A lot of changes were happening from Kraepelinian understanding. A group of people wanted to make psychiatry fully biological, and they were terming themselves neo-Kraepelinian. Then there was the influential people in general hospitals of various American states, influential physicians as well as influential psychiatrists who tried to balance this developing biological understanding with old psychoanalytical understanding. And then there was a third group who were psychoanalysts and tried to maintain their ways. And in between this three-way struggle, Engels' biopsychosocial model was a breach. It made all three groups satisfied to some extent. And ultimately, that created a very strong vocal support for Engels' biopsychosocial model. This is also an influential time because this was the time of DSM-3. Again, DSM-3 was not only a diagnostic manual, it was a political manual, it was a social manual. If anyone is interested to know what happened at that time, then I would suggest them to read the book, The Making of DSM-3. It is a book very hard to find. There is a copy in archive.org or where you can take it for 1 hour length and you can read it, or you have to buy it. It is written by Hannah Decker. The name is The Making of DSM-3, a Diagnostic Manual's Conquest of American Psychiatry. It is a very interesting read. You would get the idea how a group of people in between their discussion created most of the things that are now psychiatric diagnoses. Before DSM-3, there was no anxiety. People of that time didn't know that anxiety can be a diagnostic term, can be a disease. They also never diagnosed any depression. They never diagnosed any OCD. All the names in psychiatry that was listed as diagnosis was number 1, major psychosis, and some people who used to go further, they used to say major psychosis has 2 different division, which is Kraepelin's idea of schizophrenia and bipolar. That was the substantiated scientific understanding of that time. They never knew any disease named as depression, any disease named as anxiety, any disease named as phobia and things like that. All these names were at that time used by people to express their feeling. These are colloquial languages, and these colloquial languages were taken out from normal people language and was given names as diseases or symptoms based on understanding of a select group of people who were 3 groups amongst themselves. One was neo-Kraepelinians, 1 was psychoanalyst, and 3 were the balancing. This is the curious and very, very unscientific origin of DSM-3. Yes, many people would think that this means I am insulting the full diagnostic classification, or I am insulting the psychiatric taxonomy. In a way, I am saying that they are not science-based. I am not saying they are bad. I am not saying they are complete failure. I am just saying they are product of not scientific understanding. They are product of a compromise. That compromise was reached between 3 groups of people. So they are more academic politics based, more compromise based than really science. They are needed. As we progress on this discussion, we would understand that they are needed. But they are also not really good science. So after DSM-3 gave us blockbuster idea of anxiety, phobia, dysphoria, obsessive compulsive disorder, the diagnostic manual was a hit because it gave psychoanalysts the analytical sessions. They can use their psychoanalytical skill on patients with dysphoria, on patients with anxiety, on patients with phobia. It gave the psychopharmacologists of that time some grip on target symptoms, and they tried to cure those symptoms. It also gave the philosophers who were trying to form some background philosophy of this new branch of science, some idea that this is how things work and this is how things doesn't work. Then the other two stakeholders, the people from psychology background and the people from sociology background, they also had some common ground because this gave them some work to do. They can do some change in social fabric. They can do some changes in rehabilitation section by adapting to this new form of classification. And that, in a nutshell, is how DSM-3 conquered first America, then world. Once we started seeing world from the view of DSM-3 categories and things like that, we started expanding on them. And in American Psychiatric Association and its meeting, regular voting was done to include new and new names in the categorical system. This was resulting in various revisions of DSM-3 category and gave us DSM-3 revised edition. Then DSM-4 came, DSM-4 text revision, which came when I was a student, and then finally DSM-5. All these elaborations were based more and more on these artificial categories that were proposed as a compromise between multiple varying factions inside the new academic science known as psychiatry. So each itineraries of DSM and in extension ICD gave us more details, but gave us a sort of shackles and a sort of artificial boundaries, artificial categories which doesn't exist. because brain is ultimately a single organ and brain doesn't work the way people in 1960s and 1970s envisioned. They are not to be blamed. They had their limited sense, they had their limited science, they had their limited technology. So based on that, they envisioned those things. But what was needed was repeated replication, repeated falsifying, and repeated fact finding inside the system, which was not done. So, one set of cult was psychoanalysis, and psychoanalysis psychiatry traded for another set of cult, the elaborate phenomenological diagnosis without any practical brain basis. So we just traded fanaticism. We never really questioned ourselves. Let me give one single example. Although it is not really related to DSM, but if I analyze it further, you would find that it is really related to DSM. In 1988, Kane et al. Published a study on treatment-resistant schizophrenia and clozapine. Their idea of treatment resistance, if we read the Kane criteria, then it included 60 mg haloperidol. And question is, do we see any patient receiving that dose nowadays? Hardly. But that study said clozapine is the golden molecule for treatment-resistant schizophrenia without understanding what is treatment-resistant schizophrenia, what is schizophrenia, what is even their basics of diagnosing schizophrenia. That was established in 1988. Today it is 2024 and we are still following Kane and his ideas without doing a replication study. There is no replication from 1988 to 2024. In any other branches of science, by now there would have been at least 1,000 replication and cross-validation studies. In psychiatry, we do none. And that is how we encourage a kind of dogmatism. Standing in 2024, when the basis of schizophrenia is in question, when we know that there exists no disease homogeneous schizophrenia, rather it is a common syndromic name for a group of diseases which might be few million strong in number, we are still following the same observation of Kane et al. We know much more than that time. Our knowledge has expanded like anything. I don't know if a person who has lived in 1998 is put in 2024 and asked about psychiatry, what he or she would say. He or she would probably say, we have ascended to a level that is unimaginable for he, him or her. But in treatment segment, we are still the same. Our understanding has exploded light years. Our medicine sense is growing like a snail because, again, due to DSM and ICD, our criteria is limited. These criteria, which was formed in 1970 were never truly examined. Whenever someone questioned their validity and their usefulness, they were silenced and made to repent. For example, let me give one person's name, Thomas himself. He was the person who wanted to launch RDoc and who was director of NIMH in 2012-2013. But then his whole ideas were rejected. He tried to cut down the funding to phrenological research and he tried to divert more funding to basic science researchers. He was discredited, was made to leave NIMH, and that is not the end of story. Ultimately, after doing a lot of things, being in Alphabet, being in other companies, at the end of his life, he had to publicly apologize for his 2013 and 2012 behavior. That is how strong our fanaticism in this field is. Does that mean DSM and ICD are all wrong, all bad thing? No, they are not. They are not at all. Because in any scientific subject, we need a set of rules. The set of rules gives us the foundation to progress, to do a thing. But in psychiatry, there is no set of such rules. So we need some set of taxonomy, some set of criteria that would at least help patients and their physicians to communicate with each other. But that should be kept at the level of communication. That should not be used as a tag. For example, if I say, let's say I am seeing a patient today. I am giving some form of treatment. Then the patient gets transferred to Mandan. And I tell to Mandan that this patient has chronic psychosis with recurrent depression and I am giving this medication. He would understand perfectly that this is the symptomatology. But this should be the communication language. I should not say this patient has disease named psychosis, this patient has a disease named depression, and these are the sacrosanct medication for these diseases. There can be no medication other than this. If I say this, then it is just dogmatism. If I say the former and use it as a means of communication, then I am giving him what I have seen, what I have given, and I am giving him full liberty to re-explore, re-understand and reformulate the symptomatology as well as treatment so that the patient gets better. This is where DSM has failed and ICD, being the follower of DSM, has failed. It has made these categories sacrosanct, these artificial categories diseases, and that makes all the trials, all the clinical explorations wrong. Because let's say I am testing a group of patients on a particular drug. Let's just say I am using drug X on a group of patients to see whether they are benefited or not. For our study, we take a group of patients who have symptoms which resembles depression. So, with 2024's knowledge, what we should have done? We should have taken a group of patients who are showing low mood, who are showing withdrawal, social, as well as various other forms of withdrawal, who are showing this behavior over a long period, and who also have increased fearfulness, increased risk aversive tendencies, and that has been consistent throughout their life. If this cohort of patients were given drug X, we could have expected the result of drug X on this group of patients. But unfortunately, we are not doing it. What we are doing? We are using artificial DSM criteria, and we are taking patients cross-sectionally. We are taking every patient who are showing low mood, who are showing lethargy, who are showing withdrawal at that moment. We are not taking the longitudinal history. This patient might be a patient who were having a lot of attention deficit, a lot of irritability, a lot of impulsive behavior, but at that moment, due to some brain dysfunction, that person was in low mood. We are giving the same patient drug X, as well as we are giving another patient drug X who has lifelong obsessive trait, lifelong risk aversive trait, lifelong overthinking and overanalysis, and lifelong inability to communicate with people. And we are expecting drug X would show us whether this patient would improve or not. In no branch of medicine it can happen. In no branch of medicine we can give a Eskimo and a Sub-Saharan African people a same sort of, let's say, food and expect them to benefit. This is the crudest contrary of what we are, example of what we are doing in nowadays clinical trial. No wonder most drugs are failing to show much effects today. And we are being flooded by Me Too drugs because companies don't know what to do. That is why less and less investment is being done in neuroscience treatment. Because companies are getting zero return on their investment. If a drug gets blockbuster status, it stays as blockbuster. No new drug reaches that level. And with each failure, we are going back. Then, due to this same artificial criteria of DSM and ICD, our policies same artificial criteria, our policy making is at flaw because we are expecting everyone who has depression would show same response to social measures, environmental measures, and things like that. And we are making things that way for them. That is not going to work because a patient who has depression today actually has underlying various impulsive trait, compulsive trait, drug addiction, things like that. And ultimately they would follow a trajectory which would give them some neurodegeneration later, which may be going to frontotemporal dementia. And a patient who has a depression today probably has lifelong obsessive trait, lifelong inability to comprehend social behavior, lifelong inability to do a lot of things, and ultimately would develop some sort of Parkinsonian neurodegeneration later. How can these two persons respond to same sort of policies? They cannot. They won't. And that is why our rehabilitation policies are getting destroyed all over the world. Be it in Australia, be it in America, be it in Canada, be it in UK, our rehabilitation is a failure. Our psychiatric patients never get better. They just go slightly well and they again come back because of this same failure of our understanding in rehabilitation. What is good for one set of patient is not good for another set of patient, and we fail to understand that because of our reliance on 1970s understanding of brain. We have never progressed, although we have progressed a light year. That is the uniqueness of psychiatry. Here, Paleolithic age and quantum age runs side by side. This dichotomy, this extreme contrast is what is the essence of psychiatry in all over the world. So that is where DSM and ICD failed us.
That's a really interesting observation and a good sort of overview of the journey that we've had. What and how do you see things going forward? What do you think is the future direction then?
Ultimately, the future direction would be widely different, because I don't know who would be the brain physicians of tomorrow. I am scared because I am seeing either a radical change that is going to happen in psychiatry, or some other sort of physicians would take over our job. I don't know which would happen. Only future will tell. But the brain physicians of future would see things from a completely different point of view. Let's say is there any way I can show some picture in this conversation?
There will be a share screen option. Or what you can do is, if you tell me, are you going to show something from Google? Then in that case, I can search it on the internet.
I am sending you the thing. It's
Okay.
better. Just do.
Sure.
There is a picture I'm sending you.
Sure. I think it's a very interesting, but at the same time very relevant point that you made, especially with regards to the rehabilitation side of things. And very recently, a lot of, I think, because one of the challenges as far as, a lot of countries is concerned is also the idea of people going off sick because of mental health issues.
Yes.
And the government's struggling with the whole idea of signing off. If you go to your GP and say that I am depressed and I cannot go to work, the GP has no option but to sign you off, or the mental health team doesn't have any option but to sign you off. And then these people would not return to work for months and years, etc., etc. But then how can this be compared or managed in a society where the number of people going off sick and living on benefits keeps on increasing, and especially more so because of mental health issues? And
Yes.
they get the same benefits as someone who, say, with schizophrenia, or someone with bipolar, or someone with cancer, or someone with a severe other physical health issue gets, who is genuinely very debilitated. Not to say that someone with depression cannot be as debilitated,
Hmm.
but the chances of this being used as an easy escape to live on benefits is something that I think a lot of societies and a lot of countries are thinking about, more and more so, when people also don't want to take money off of social welfare.
Yes.
So I
For
think that,
example, in
yeah,
Australia, they are now desperate to find out who is actually suffering from autism spectrum disorder and who
yeah,
is claiming to be suffering from autism spectrum disorder. There is a extreme problem in various provinces of Australia where they are getting fund crisis.
absolutely. Yeah, I think that that problem is there here as well, all over the world, I think. I will share the first picture first, and I share the second one,
Hmm.
so
First, so
that
the
you can
first
walk
picture.
us through the
Hmm.
through both the pictures. Okay.
Yes.
So I think this is the first one. Yeah.
Yes. Just make it slightly left-sided. Yes. Hmm. So this is how we evolved, and
Mm.
I wanted to show this picture to understand how we are going in future. In this picture in a nutshell shows our tries from pure medical biomedical point of view to create a taxonomy for psychiatric disorders. First, there was the MacLean model. MacLean came up with a reptilian brain, a mammalian brain, and a brain of apes, the new mammalian brain, who said. This was initially accepted, but later, when it was observed in utero that all three layers developed simultaneously, it was rejected. But if we see in a different light, rather than from neurodevelopment point of view, this model is actually basis of all future things. Let's say the reptilian brain, or what MacLean tried to think as reptilian brain, is actually the basic brain structure needed to survive in a body. This contains brainstem, this contains midbrain, this contains the basal ganglia. This is important for any animal who has a vertebral column to walk around, to maintain body homeostasis, and to do the basic environmental interaction. So this is what was expressed in those models. But MacLean thought that this came from reptiles. The revised understanding should be this actually not came from reptile. Rather, it is the basic vertebral animal unit to make basic living possible. Then came the mammalian brain. The mammalian brain includes limbic system. Mammalian brain includes other areas and primitive neocortex. This gave a layer of social interaction on these basic brain areas. These basic brain areas need rapid interactions amongst themselves to be able to work meaningfully in a society, to be work meaningfully in a primitive society. That part was handled by primitive neocortex, limbic system, and others. Then, as the social structure became more and more complex, the neocortex increased and gave us the huge brain of human. So this becomes the neo-mammalian brain, and this is actually the more complex socially interacting brain. All these complex neocortex is there to adjust to the complex social hierarchy and social structure that we have. And why I want to start from here? Because ultimately all these three gave us to next stage of evolution of taxonomy, and which is going to be progress in future. The next step came from Jack Panksepp. Jack Panksepp is another very influential figure who created the first textbook of biological psychiatry in 2003-2004. And I personally am very grateful to him because that textbook gave me understanding of brain in psychiatry. His textbook is of historical value at this moment because it is so backdated. But if anyone is interested in knowing how a person sitting in 1980s and 1990s started combining the various primitive understanding into various brain networks, then his textbook of biological psychiatry would be a very interesting read. He created various networks. These networks are our basis of today's network understanding. He created a network of play, a network of care, a network of seeking, a network of lust, a network of rage, a network of fear, and a network of pain. If you understand in this picture, you would see that the panic, fear, these have more representation from the primitive brain structure, that is the so-called reptilian brain structure. Then rage, lust, seeking, they are more of a early social reaction brain or so-called mammalian brain. And play, care is the higher social brain as well as the neo-mammalian brain. So MacLean model in a way gave us accept the idea to divide things in these. Then came Art-Dog. Art-Dog actually expanded on this Panksepp model. Art-Dog didn't came as sudden revelation. The people who created Art-Dog, they say that it came as sudden revelation. No, it is not. It is actually expansion of the understanding of Panksepp. It created cognitive system based on the neo-mammalian understanding, and it contains play, care mostly along with slightly seeking. Then social processes came, positive valence came, negative valence came, arousal and regulation came. And as you compare MacLean model to Art-Dog, you would slowly start seeing the link. And from here, we are going to move forward. This is where we are going to end up in future. In future, the brain scientists, whoever they are, neurologists, psychiatrists, or some group of scientists unknown to us today, they would start finding behavioral endophenotype, and they would go beyond the behavioral endophenotype. How they would find the behavioral endophenotype? They would divide the cognitive system into multiple domains. They would make the cognitive system into cognitive control, working memory, declarative memory, language perception, attention. In attention, they would create short-term attention, long-term attention, attention task specific, attention, process specific, and things like that, which is already people are starting. Then the social process, positive valence, all they would start in, they would be starting into dividing various other things. And ultimately, this would create measurable behavioral endophenotype. At present, the widest understandable behavioral endophenotype that we have is personality. For example, obsessive compulsive personality trait. When I say it, anyone who has some understanding of psychiatry, they would see a sort of few images in their brain. That is actually one kind of behavioral endophenotype. Obsessive compulsive personality trait is a behavioral endophenotype for a lot of whole body disturbances. A person who is going to develop Parkinsonism in future, a person who is going to develop various kind of metabolic disorders in future, a person who is going to develop cancers in future would have obsessive compulsive personality disorder. Then impulsive or attention deficit personality trait is another trait that is kind of behavioral endophenotype. A person, it is also a pan vulnerability status. Means a person who develop severe level of attention deficit trait in childhood would have higher chances of autoimmune diseases in future, would have higher chances of type 1 diabetes in future, would have higher chances of various forms of pancreatitis and various type of end organ damage in future. So these are all, also they would develop various forms of frontotemporal dementia in future. So personality trait is the closest behavioral endophenotype that we have today. But in future, people would develop more and more into it. This is one form they would do. Now come to the second picture. This is the better understanding. Let's upload the second picture now.
Sure. Let me see how to do that.
I know this picture, when you see, it feels very crowded, very intimidating. But let me explain and it will be very easy. This is a picture that shows the future. And this is a future that is actually foreseeable. Various labs in the world is already trying to emulate this thing. So in future, people would start dividing things into neurohormonal, pure environmental, or rather environmental influence manifested by genetic vulnerability and pure genetic vulnerability. These three ways. Now, neurohormonal influence would be various hormonal axes, like let's say HPA axis, HPT axis, HPG axis, and things like that. Then various hormonal level, environmental influence. There is no pure environmental influence. For example, traumatic brain injury also would depend on whether the person has underlying mutation in various phosphodiesterase, various immune system molecules, or in various ways of brain repair or not. Similarly, teratogen expressor would also depend on inherited ability to manage DNA repair or not, inherited ability to screen DNA abnormalities or not, and things like that. And ultimately, epigenetic regulation of various brain and body processes would also be dependent on the non-coding part of DNA. Then there would be pure and pure genetic vulnerability. Like, let's say, various inherited mutations giving rise to disrupted neurodevelopment or increasing the heritable CNVs, that is copy number variabilities, or increasing mutation in various brain processes and its molecular coordinates. Can also be somatic mutation, which is not shown in this picture, which is going to affect the same thing. And what would be the end result that we can see? Blunted striatal response to incentive. Let's say our striatum has a group of neurons, or our hippocampus. This is just example of striatum. I can make it hippocampus. Our hippocampus or our striatum has a group of neurons that responds to different kind of environmental stimulation. Hippocampus, if I say hippocampus or amygdala or striatum, they have different incentives. For amygdala, it is threat, environmental threat, and environmental threat would cause activation of amygdala. For striatum, it is incentive, that is some pleasurable thing that is seen or felt in the environment. For hippocampus, it is some process associated with some function. But any three of these, either neurohormonal influences or mixed environmental and genetic influences or pure genetic influences, can blunt development of this stimulation in response to the environmental stimulation, and that way the striatum or the hippocampus or the amygdala would fail to respond to environmental cues, and that would give rise to a psychological phenotype. What would that be? In case of striatum blunted response, that would be anhedonia trait and irritability trait. If it is blunted hippocampus, then the trait would be completely opposite. The trait would come into as daredevil, attention deficit, and novelty seeking. Anyway, so let's talk with striatum because that would be easier to follow for you. Then if a person has this phenotype, then there is behavioral bias. Two types of behavioral bias can happen. Either there would be reward seeking, that is first behavioral bias. Second behavioral bias is passive avoidance of various stressful stimuli, and that is there will be immobilization. Now there is another subcortical endophenotype that can happen, that is strong amygdala reactivity to danger. If that is combined with blunted striatal response, then that would lead to unipolar depression. But if there is only blunted striatal response to incentive, then that would lead to attention deficit. Now there are some other endophenotype, for example prefrontal dysfunction or executive dysfunction, then that would lead to behavioral bias C as executive emotional dysregulation, executive control, bad executive control, and that would again give rise to both ADHD and unipolar depression. So you can see by this different way of analysis, we can go to deeper and deeper and create various unique parameters. I have given you example of what is written here, and if you listen to me closely, I have given you various other endophenotypes by way of description, and these are known. There are various yet unknown endophenotypes about which we don't know about. For example, there is a group of people in whom the day-night response is blunt or exaggerate. They would contribute to another circadian phenotype. The example of this group of people in whom the response is very sensitive to circadian rhythm, you would see them as cyclothymic, you would see them as seasonal affective disorder, you would see them as cycloid psychosis, which is an old term, or you would see them as the prototypical bipolar disorder where there is mood episodes during spring, during autumn. So that way there is circadian endophenotype. If you think, you would find out there are numerous endophenotype in brain. Circadian, then vasopressor response. If you think there is a group of disease known as, I would not say disease, I would say disorder known as POTS, postural orthostatic tachycardia and syncope syndrome, POTS syndrome. Initially it was very rare, now we find it is very common. Previously we didn't know it, so it was in POTS. The vasopressor response is reverse. The barometers are highly sensitive, so whenever the baroreceptors are highly sensitive, baroreceptor pathways are highly sensitive, so whenever there is heightened emotional reaction or standing or any form of autonomic activation, first there is a sharp rise of BP followed by severe baroreceptor reflex activation and reflex inhibition of vasomotor center, resulting in fall of BP and tachycardia, and which gives rise to POTS syndrome. This is a type of endophenotype for high baroreceptor reflex. The more we discuss, you would find there are more endophenotype which are scattered around us, and we just don't know them, so we give them various names. Actually, POTS is found more in so-called cluster B personality disorder, and ultimately it is one of the autonomic endophenotypes. Now you know it and you would start finding it amongst your cluster B patients. You would start finding many of them would have undiagnosed POTS feature, but that is because we don't correlate. That is again a fault of our diagnostic system. We have made it so small, I would say, impenetrable fortresses out of diagnoses that we cannot correlate. Our categories are so proof of every logic and everything that we cannot correlate and find out the various implications of it. So this is the future. We would start finding more and more of this endophenotype, more and more of this behavioral endophenotype, and ultimately we would start linking them and creating a new taxonomy of brain where there would not be any neurological disorder, there would not be any psychiatric disorder because they cannot coexist. Brain doesn't understand neurology or psychiatry. Brain understands only one thing, that is its biological working. This imperfect division of brain into neurology and psychiatry would go away. Already a lot of academicians all over the world are questioning whether should we keep this divide between neurology and psychiatry. And they are envisioning a future where there is a joint discipline of brain, which is a single discipline and treating the whole brain and spinal cord. So this is what is going to happen in future. Whether it would be neurology which would engulf psychiatry, or whether these two disciplines merge and would create a new discipline, that we don't. But I am scared because of cognitive neurology. Cognitive neurology is nothing but psychiatry taught to neurologists. And cognitive neurology 3 years fellowship has started in different corners of the world where neurologists are starting to learn psychiatry. Yes, their knowledge is still very rudimentary. Their knowledge is still very imperfect. But they would progress with their knowledge. And until and unless we start questioning ourselves, we start thinking ourselves and our subject scientifically, there is a large chance that cognitive neurology would become the new psychiatry.
I think it is very pertinent, and I think back in the day, whenever we've seen whatever little progress that has been made with regards to understanding behavioral sciences and psychiatry as we know it, has been people who have been, a lot of contributors have been people who have qualified as neurologists first, or neurologists essentially, and then also up psychiatry. So our understanding, it seems like, not only as far as the DSM and ICD is concerned, but even psychiatry as a science is something which, of course, very closely overlaps with neurology. One also tends to think that the more and more these two things get combined and the more and more AI pitches in, because the way AI works, and for anyone who's very new to the world of AI, I would highly recommend do an introductory course on AI, because that also helps someone who's just starting off understand how the brain works, especially language models, especially computation. I think it's very interesting because that also tends to help us understand. However, something that AI doesn't dwell deep into, AI is very creative. Like, AI can write poems for you, it can write rap songs, and hence the whole idea of initially that AI will never be able to do creativity or creative engines, or it wouldn't have the idea of novelty is slowly vanishing, because AI is also creating all those new algorithms which helps it produce content rather than just being content consumer and content summarizer. But then the challenge is the emotional side of it, and that's where I feel that psychiatry is a beautiful science as well. Mental health is a beautiful science because, like you say, it works on preserving individuality and celebrating individuality rather than trying to know or get away with deviance. So thank you so much for this fascinating conversation today. I think we've decided what our next topic will be, and we will be back soon with that topic as well. But any closing remarks?
I would say that on line of your last AI discussion, the difference between AI and any sentient animal is the concept of I, the concept of self. And there is a odd fear going around in science circle that AI would someday kill humanity. AI would someday think that humanity is imperfect, specifically when we would have generative AI or all-purpose AI or general intelligence AI, deep learning, general intelligence AI. Unfortunately, if we understand the way consciousness work and the way this concept of self work, that day we get general intelligence AI is that day we would need a new definition of consciousness, because generative AI would also develop the sense of I. Generative AI would develop self perspective. It would understand itself and it would start working towards betterment of its own self, and that would make it as faulty, as imperfect as we are. So there is no future where AI replaces humanity. At worst case scenario, we would have a competitive race which have generated from Earth. Yes, that race is not purely carbon based. That might be silicon based. They might be on some other branched atom based. Or at base scenario is we are going to have one pure AI race, one pure AI slave race, one human AI merger race, and one human race. The four derivative race of current humanity. So that is the fascinating thing about brain, because brains also says that AI cannot erase humanity, because the moment AI develop a brain capable of emulating humanity, the AI would also gain sentiment, and all sentient creatures are as faulty as human.
Yeah, absolutely. On that note, the last interesting bit that I would mention for our listeners is that all these videos are summarized and captioned by AI. And it fascinates me. I used to hire editors, I used to hire people to do the subtitles for me, to do summaries for me, but nothing has ever been half as efficient as AI
Yes.
doing all these things. And the videos that you're seeing right now, the captions that you're seeing, the subtitles you're seeing, all the psychiatry, but
Yes. Bye bye. Good.
and
Have a
thank
good
you as
day.
always.
Bye bye.